So my husband's dad is the VP of operations for a company that employs truck drivers for delivery. Anytime a driver hits brakes, speeds excessively, swerves, or anything like that, a camera automatically records just before to just after the incident. It's always on and running, but only records when an unsafe event occurs, and that footage is automatically uploaded and my father-in-law views it. There are 2 cameras, one of them records the driver and one faces the road. He basically determines whether disciplinary action needs to be taken if the driver is driving inappropriately. Now, my father-in-law received a video last spring, and I'm going to describe the events for you. 2 truck drivers were driving down a 2-lane road late at night, early morning. It's pitch black outside, but they see something ahead on the road. As they get closer, you can actually see a female in a white dress walking in their lane. The person turns around to look at them as they pass through or by them. But what the video doesn't show is that they stop and jump out because they don't believe there is any way that they didn't hit this girl. They don't see anyone in the road, no one is in the ditch, no blood or evidence of anyone was there in fact. They were still convinced though that they'd hit someone, so they called the police. The police showed up to write a police report and investigate, but found nothing upon searching the surrounding area. Some research was done into the area, and it actually turns out that in 2013, a girl was walking in the road there and was killed when struck by 2 vehicles. My father-in-law is not tech-savvy by any means, so he logged into his corporate account on my husband's laptop, and we helped him download the video. Unfortunately, for legal reasons, I'm not allowed to share the video, but I did take some screen grabs for you guys to look at. In the video, you can actually see that there are 2 cones that have the shoulder blocked off, which didn't allow them to swerve out of the way. You can see them approaching the woman who was walking in their lane. You can see their reactions before and after passing the lady, and the speed that they were traveling at too. I have the screen grabs of internal emails discussing the event, and the subject line is the ghost incident, but I 100% can't post those. But the entire incident has them in a tizzy, for a lack of a better term. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the pictures, and it's a weird one for sure. So this happened to me about 5 years ago, during which I was working at an after-school music studio teaching private lessons. The building I worked in was an old walk-up, one of the oldest buildings in the town in fact, and supposedly it was haunted, according to my boss anyway. Almost all of my co-workers had really strange experience late at night at that studio, while closing up or on their own and whatnot. I had had some pretty strange experiences as well, hearing people fiddling around with a piano when there was no one in the room, hearing footsteps and people talking when I was the only one there, stuff like that. I've always been sensitive to these things, so it actually didn't freak me out that much. I just assumed that it was some spirit or energy that was still in the building, and I ignored it most of the time anyway. However, one night, I had just finished my last lesson of the evening and I was closing up. I was the last teacher there, and there was just something very eerie about the feeling in the building that night. I felt as if somebody was genuinely in the room with me and was watching my every move. I got my stuff and hustled out of the building as quickly as I could. But driving back home, I just couldn't shake the feeling that somebody was in the car with me. I had never felt that before, but I felt as if whatever it was in that building felt lonely or something, and maybe it attached itself to me. As usual, I took it off, and I tried not to think about it for the rest of the night. The next morning, my boyfriend had left for work early as usual, around 6 o'clock, and I got up later in the morning, 8:30, to get ready for my day. I step into the shower, and immediately I feel a person's presence just so strongly. This thought pops into my head that this person in here is watching me shower. I know that sounds insane, but I just felt it so intensely. so out loud I decided to yell, "Please leave me alone." And immediately, I heard my front door slam. Not my bathroom door, but my front door. And then I no longer felt this person's presence. I finished my shower, dried off, and I decided to take a look at my front door entrance, and I saw the scariest thing that I think that I've ever seen in my life. 2 wet footprints right in front of that door. This really did happen, and I've tried to reason it away and find logical explanations, but nothing has made sense so far. I genuinely believe that this was a spirit, and it got a little bit too close for comfort, let's say, and decided to pop in the shower with me that morning. I, a 23-year-old female, grew up in a rural area in Ontario. It was the kind of place where you never really lock your doors because, well, you know everyone in town. The all-too-trusting small-town mentality stayed with me once I moved to a big city for university. I got an apartment in a student area with a college nearby and plenty of bars within walking distance. I lived with a guy friend, Roddy, who was a few years older than me from the same small town. I would go to the bar with friends on the weekends and stumble home by myself around 2 a.m. One night, on my way home, my neighbour Kyle and I met in the hallway, both headed to our own places. He was also drunk and so good-looking. He said hello and invited me inside, and I ended up staying the night with him. He was nice, and it was a fun night, if not a little bit awkward. We didn't exchange numbers, and it didn't seem like he cared for anything to come of it, so I went home in the morning, and that was that. Fast forward to 2 days later, though. I was asleep in my bed, and my roommate was half asleep on the couch with the TV on, and he heard a sound that might have been the door creaking open, but he ignored it in his tired state. A few minutes later, he opened his eyes to see a naked man standing in front of him, lifeless and staring into his eyes. It was Kyle. Roddy tried to talk to him and ask him what the heck he was doing here, but he didn't respond. Roddy ran to my room and said, I think Kyle is here to see you. So I followed him out into the living room and saw a completely naked Kyle staring at us with the most serious and concentrated eyes that I had ever seen. I tried to talk to him and ask him to leave, but once again he just didn't respond. Instead, he went into our kitchen and opened the fridge. He proceeded to take our butter out and started smearing it all over his face and chest, saying nothing, and still with a completely serious look on his face. Roddy and I just ran to my bedroom to talk about what to do. While we were in the room, Kyle walked down the dark hallway that led to us and stood in the dark right before the light of my room could reach him. All you could do was see his silhouette, and he started whispering just my name over and over again, repeatedly. Roddy and I ended up calling the police and staying in my room until they came and took him back to his house. They said that he must have been on drugs, but probably wasn't a threat. I agreed too, and I didn't think that he was a threat, but I didn't sleep well that night knowing that he was a thin wall away from us in this apartment. I should add here as well that I talked to Kyle about a week later, and he had no memory of doing this, but he did call 911 on himself and got an ambulance to the hospital the next morning because he had severe sunstroke, so it was likely sunstroke-induced delirium or something. He's okay now, thankfully, but anyway, that was probably the cause of that. But we forgot to lock our doors another time. I was at work and Roddy was at home. I got a text from him that said, "Please get home. Someone is here and I think you must know them because I don't." So I took an early lunch and came home to see what was going on. There was a man with greasy black hair so long that it nearly reached his elbows. He was pacing back and forth in our living room, and before I even got a chance to speak to him, I realized that he was definitely not mentally present. He would alternate between screaming at the top of his lungs like he was being murdered, and then he would cry and say things like, "I can feel the pain and suffering of everyone in the world," I can hear the voices of the poor and the tormented in my brain begging me to help them. I can't stand this suffering. Nobody understands my powers and ability to know what everyone is thinking. I would chime in to politely ask, "Do you know where you are, or what is your address? I can help you get home." And then he would scream at us because this was his house and he wasn't leaving. He wanted us to stop judging him. After about 10 minutes of him rambling and pacing, he finally said his address to us, which was actually the neighbouring apartment where Kyle lived. I knew Kyle had a roommate that I met, John, but apparently this was their third roommate. I went to his door and knocked, and thankfully, the roommate John opened the door and came to retrieve the rambling man. Later that night, John knocked on our door and I opened it to see him holding a bottle of wine. He wanted to thank us for handling the situation well and making sure that he got home. Apparently the man had recently been in a mental hospital and left on his own accord and walked into the wrong apartment. His parents came and got him, and he's back in hospital now, safe and sound, thankfully. But to have two people from the same apartment do such strange things just by coming over randomly and acting so bizarre, it certainly got me worried. My unit in the US Army was deployed to Iraq in April of 2006. We were in Ramadi. It was 123 kilometers, 77 miles out of Baghdad. I was in my Humvee, headed to Baghdad for emergency leave due to a death in my family. It was close to midnight. The Humvee that I was in had 3 others and a turret gunner. The 2 other Humvees had the same 5 total people, one in front, one in back. I was without a weapon due to my leave. The Humvee in front stopped hard, and we all figured that it was a possible IED or VB IED. The team leader in our HV radioed the lead HV, and the convo went something like this. "Hey, what's up? Why did you stop? Hey, something flew in front of the HV." "What? Flew in front of the HV?" "Yeah." "Well, we didn't see anything." And the third HV piped in with, "Hey, does anyone hear that hello?" Yeah, but I don't see it. Did the other 2 vehicles?" And just then in the desert off the highway was a black figure, and it looked like a huge bird. It looked like maybe smoke was emitting from it. A blackish, greenish smoke with a bit of a blue tinge. We all focused our eyes. The 2 troops with better nods, night vision, could see something, but couldn't make out what it was. The smoke was apparently distorting the view. And within a second or 2, a rock was thrown at one of the Humvees. A big rock too, like the size of somebody's head. We used a spotlight, and in that light, something just flew straight up, and it was loud. And then we heard what I can only describe as a loud screeching noise. Within a minute, it was over, but we all just sort of sat there in a state of shock, curiosity, and panic. And I mean, what the heck was that? When we got back to Baghdad, the translator that we were picking up to bring to the Marines, he was there with us. And he said that it sounded like we encountered an Ifrit. A team leader said, "A what?" And he said, "An Ifrit, a winged jinn." We were all a bit speechless. We chose not to disclose to our command the winged thing and instead just described it as battle fatigue. It was well known that PTSD was a career killer at this juncture. It's been 13 years since this happened. I met my now husband in 2015, and he had also been deployed to Ramadi with my sister unit at the time, and he had went through this particular stretch of the highway on his mid-deployment leave. He recounted a similar story to me, and it was enough to stop me in my tracks. It was actually pretty close to mine, except they didn't stop, they just sort of boogied on through. Considering the time we were there for was pretty deadly, including an aid station manned by soldiers that was ambushed and blown to bits. I was a medic, so death was my norm at the time, but I still can't wrap my mind around it. And now, apparently the last two places I live in, something seems to have followed us. I might share those stories another time, but for now, I'll leave it here. This happened a few nights ago, and I just really can't stop thinking about it. Now, I work in the criminal justice system, and I see a lot of crime, and am also naturally a follower of subreddits, scary movies, and scary stories in general. So I kind of have to disclaim that I do have a heightened sense of paranoia sometimes. That I'll admit happily. But my girlfriend and her roommate both agreed that this was just really weird. So I was out walking my girlfriend's roommate's dog as she was working a night shift in their neighborhood, which is a very safe suburb of New York. I walked across the parking lot into this field in the middle of a rotary, or a roundabout, whatever you call them. I lived in Boston for a while, and they call them rotaries there, and was just sort of screwing around in Reddit since it was nearing midnight and in the middle of quarantine and there were no cars out. The dog has a long leash, and so she was sniffing around, and then I kind of saw her stop and stare towards the road. I looked up, and I saw a black SUV stopped in the rotary. I pulled on my COVID mask that was on my chin. Since nobody was around, I had it sort of half off, as some people in New York are pretty touchy about that. Understandably too, just in case they stopped to lecture me, and I didn't care to engage in a dumb argument. I looked back at my phone and then back at the SUV that was still there. There was a family, mother, father in the front, and a 12-year-old daughter in the back seat, and I was a bit startled because they were all just sort of blankly staring directly at me. I sort of waved and nodded and started walking the dog a bit around the grass again, and they started to slowly move. They came around the rotary, and I looked back, and all of them were again staring directly at me. I figured that they may talk to me, so I stopped and waited for them to sort of get around the circle, but when they approached, they kept driving very slowly or staring directly at me still. I gave another half wave, and they drove past me, still slowly and staring, back around the circle, then again around the circle. Literally all of them blanket staring at me, even the little girl in the back seat. I put my arms up in like a shrugging gesture as if to say, "What are you guys doing?" They did this a couple more times, and I started to walk up to the edge of the circle to engage. Normally something I would not do, but it was a family, so I sort of felt a bit more brave to do so. They sped up a bit and went around the corner and turned off the rotary. I started to feel even weirder, so I decided that I would walk back to her apartment building when they entered the rotary again. I was sort of watching them out of the corner of my eye, and they were still staring. I started picking up the pace, and they turned off the rotary towards me and picked up the pace as they followed me. Once again, I got to the sidewalk, and I turned around because I didn't want them to know which door I was walking into. It's on a strip mall with a few other apartment buildings and stores. And they stopped about 30 feet behind me, and they were all staring out the front window. The little girl was in the center seat, now staring too. I once again raised my arms to be like, "Can I help you?" And no response at all from them. I just kind of stood there with no movement, and took my phone back out and typed their license plate into a notepad. Again, a weird thing that I do, probably because of my work in criminal defense and general paranoia, not really knowing what I would do with it. Then they slowly turned to the other side of the parking lot, all still staring until they got to the end of the lot, and I rushed into the apartment building, which luckily needs a code to enter. I got up and I told my girlfriend, and then her roomie in the AM, and they both were kind of freaked out. I watched them out of a window too, and they pulled back up to where I was standing on the sidewalk and just sat there in their car for some time. I couldn't see them at this point, but the roof of their car, and it felt like maybe 10 minutes that they just sort of sat there, and then they just slowly drove away. I really just can't stop thinking about that creepy stare at me too, because somehow it made it creepier that it was just a a normal-looking family with a young daughter. If it was like two younger guys, I could have marked it off as if they were bored and just screwing with me, but this was just blank, unmoving expressions that made it so creepy. So I usually take my dog for a walk every day. Today, my dad said that he was going to the gym, so I decided to take the dog for a walk while he was still there. So I lock the door and leave, going on my usual route. On my way, I pass a large section of forest or bush. I don't know what to call it. I've always noticed a path that leads into the bushes, though, but I've never bothered with it because the usual walk is already long enough. But today I decided that I would because I wanted to see new places to walk, and my dad would be out for quite a while. I really don't like being home alone, so I thought, well, why not? So I start going along this path, and it just seemed like a normal bushwalk, really fun. At that point, I thought that I might actually go there again, in fact, tomorrow or whenever I walked him next. So I'm walking along this path for about a minute or two until I came to what I thought was a dead end, because the path ended and there was bush coming up to my knees where the path would have continued. So I go to turn around and head back, and I see something moving. It's in the deep bushes, not too far from the knee-high bush, and about 10 meters away from me, I would say. From what I could see, too, it had really long, thin arms. It was pale. It looked like it was sort of hunched over, sniffing the leaves or something on the ground. My dog made a whimpering noise and tried to chase it, and the thing looked straight up at him and just bolted. It ran further into the bushes until I couldn't see it anymore. As it ran, I noticed that it had really small legs, probably about half the length of its arms, in fact. I got out of the bushes as fast as I could, and after that, I just ran home. The thing looked very humanoid, though. I just want to know if what I saw, has anybody else seen anything like this? This happened quite a few years back when I was around 14 years old. Let me just preface this too by saying that I had previously been told by my old best friend, Jenna, that her neighbour had some really creepy tendencies. I slept over at her place a lot, but never encountered a creepy neighbour. This guy was married and had children apparently, and his house was directly behind Jenna's place. There was a wooden fence in her backyard too that separated the neighbour's backyard and theirs, and Jenna had a deck, and the stairs were a few feet off from the house, so you could fit a fairly small person in between the deck stairs and the house. You could also see into the neighbour's backyard if you were standing on the deck, but not if you were on the grass. So, with that understood, we had half a day at school, and I went back to Jenna's place. I wasn't allowed over that day, but since we were inseparable, it really didn't matter, and we weren't expecting her mum to be home from work for a good few hours anyway. Her mum ended up coming home early, so Jenna and I scrambled to the backyard so her mum wouldn't see me, so as not to get in trouble. We went outside and wedged ourselves in between the stairs and the house so her mum wouldn't hear the fence gate open, as it made a lot of noise whenever it was opened. We waited for a couple of minutes until we started hearing shuffling in her neighbour's backyard. We could faintly see him through the cracks of the wood, and it looked like he was putting out his recycling or garbage or something. Instead, he was making his way onto the bin and poking his head over the fence to look into their windows. From the backyard, you could see into Jenna's mum's window, the bathroom too, and parts of the kitchen. And we saw him, but he didn't see us. But we were shaking and holding onto each other for dear life as we watched our neighbour just stand upright on the bin to get a better view into the windows. He kept shifting from bin to bin to get better angles into what we assumed later was Jenna's mum's room, since she just got back from work and possibly into the bathroom. This went on for 5 to 10 minutes as well, us trembling and trying not to make a move or make noise while her creepy neighbour just kept trying to look into Jenna's house. He eventually got back down and went into a house like nothing had happened, while Jenna and I hopped a fence gate soon after. A few weeks later, we had another incident too where Jenna's sister took a shower late at night and went to her room. Her blinds were open and it was dark outside. There was a tree that sat in the front yard, and it was snowing pretty heavily. She called us on her phone saying that she apparently saw someone in the trees and couldn't see them anymore. We told her to turn her light off while Jenna and I did the same in her room, and we peeked out the window but couldn't see anything. We went to her sister's room though and asked what happened, and she was convinced that she saw someone in the tree who she believed was their neighbour. And so, Jenna and I went out front to investigate. By that time, he was obviously gone, but we did find fresh shoe prints in the snow that went from the neighbour's front yard to the tree, and right up to Jenna's sister's window before it trailed off back to the neighbour's house. Technically, this isn't my story, it's my mum's, but I'm slightly involved, so I'd like to share it. This happened when I was around 3 or possibly 4, since it was in the summer. My parents and I had just moved into a new house in a safer neighbourhood in order to raise me. And basically, they were looking for new 60s themed furniture for our house, so my mother took to Craigslist to try and find some. She eventually reached out to a man selling an older couch. She had just taken me out of preschool before going to his house, so I was in the car with her. My mother is generally a very intelligent woman, although I'll admit being a first-time mother, this wasn't the best idea. But she had left me in the car because she didn't think it would take so long. He was standing outside of the house and, according to her, seemed like a completely average man, probably in his late 40s. He claimed the couch was in the basement and that they would have to go down there. Apparently, the couch was completely different than the one placed in the ad, so she turned around to ask him about it. And he was sweating out of his mind and apparently just started asking her a bunch of really creepy questions along the lines of, "Are you a virgin? How old are you? And are you married?" My mother left pretty quickly after that and claims that he even chased after her down the driveway. She drove off as quickly as possible and to this day says that she thought that he was going to hit her over the head or something and sell her or something along those lines. This happened on a beach in the Philippines about 2 years ago. Me and my friends decided to take a quick vacation to let off some steam from work, and on our first night, we decided to drink outside of the hotel room. We got a little tipsy, and one of my friends decided to take a walk on the beach and try to meet some other tourists there. I had a bit of a bad feeling about what might happen to him since he was already drunk, so I decided to join him together and with another friend. He said that he wanted to visit the rock formations, which is a known gay hookup spot since the place was dark and there were no other establishments on that part of the shoreline. It stretches about half the length of a football field with just pure darkness. I was reluctant about the idea of him going in there. I must admit that I was reluctant about the idea of him going in there, but he was adamant, so I agreed as long as he comes back after a few minutes. Me and my other friends waited on the last bar on the end of the shoreline before the dark area starts. Me and my friend were talking about something when we just heard a gut-wrenching scream. It sounded like our friend, so we decided to rush in. The only light at that time is coming from the moon, so my friend decided to pull out his phone and turn on the flashlight. We asked around and saw some people hooking up on the sand. We asked if they saw our friend, giving them descriptions on what he might look like, but they said that they never saw him. Our hearts were pounding at this point because we don't know what might have happened to him. We ran until we reached the end of it. There was a huge rock on the shore about 15 feet tall with a local guy standing on the top of it. We asked him, "Have you seen our friend?" He was about my height, wearing a black shirt, and he said, "Was he gay?" I don't see the relevance of the question, but I said yes, and he said he might have gone over to the mangroves over there, and then pointed to a darker spot of the beach filled with mangroves. Using only the light on the phone, we tried searching the small area. It looks like a tiny shelter with overgrown plants acting as the roof. And when we turned back, the guy on the top of the rock is already walking towards us, and then 2 more guys popped up behind him, probably hiding behind the huge rock as well. And then the guy who was on the rock did a karate chop on my friend's arm for him to let go of his phone, which was successful as the phone rolled onto the sand, My friend was able to grab the phone back, and that's when he shouted, "Run." I was confused with what was going on, so I just started running after he said run without actually knowing what we were running from. And that was when it hit me that the whole thing was an ambush, that we were led into the mangroves for them to steal my friend's phone. I was running for a few seconds when I started feeling the weight on my feet. The sandals that I was wearing got really heavy because I wasn't aware that I was running on wet sand. My friend took off his flip-flops for him to run faster. I wanted to do the same, but then I realized my sandals were strap-on, so I just continued running. I can hear the guys chasing us saying, "Stop, we're just joking." I don't want to fall for what they said, so I continued running, and my legs are starting to feel numb since I'm not really an athletic person. And there came a point where I wanted to just stop since I don't have anything valuable with me, but then I thought that that could be a reason for them to harm me, so I just ran with all my might until we reached the first bar eventually. My friend was already there catching his breath when we saw the friend that we were looking for, laughing and talking to locals. We wanted to punch him for what he put us through, but he had no idea what had just happened, so we just let it go. Our vacation still went through, and we still got to go to the island from time to time, but we vowed to never go on that side of the beach ever again. In my old house, we not only had modern air conditioning vents, but we also had the original ones from 1922. The design was quite elaborate, though unfortunately I don't have any pictures of it. But anyways, one cool September day in 2015, I was sitting on the ground playing with my little brother, who had just turned 1. We were in the hallway at the bottom of the staircase where one of the original air vents were. We were sitting right next to it. I was playing peekaboo with him. He was laughing and smiling and really happy, just having a grand old time basically, playing with his awesome big sister. When I noticed a quiet hissing sound coming from the vent. It kind of sounded like Parseltongue from Harry Potter, if I'm being honest, but I just thought that there was something wrong with the heater or something, and I paid no mind to it. About 5 minutes after I had noticed the sound, it just suddenly stopped. I couldn't hear anything coming from it anymore, and the moment that I acknowledged that fact, my brother suddenly jumped, startled, and whipped his head around to face the vent. He had the look of just absolute fear on his face, right before he just started shrieking and crying. I mean, it honestly sounded like someone had hit this kid, he was crying so hard. Because of the way Landon was crying, my stepmom ran in from the kitchen. She looked as worried as I'd ever seen her, and she said, "Oh my goodness, what happened? Why is he crying like that? Did he hurt himself?" I explained to her what happened. Talking to Landon, who is still wailing with fear, she says, "It's okay." And then she says to me, "What do you mean he just looked at the air vent and started crying?" I said, I don't know what he heard, but obviously whatever it was terrified him." She looked at me with honest confusion. She picked up my brother, still coddling him and swaying him as he cried and walking him outside, and he was fine after a minute or two, but he would never go near that vent without someone with him. Even in 2017, after he turned 3, he would still ask for people to walk with him past that vent. I never heard anything from that specific vent, though I did hear the same hissing throughout the house when I was home alone or with one of my siblings. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little short story, and thanks for listening.